The Ukrainian territory of Crimea was annexed by the Russian Federation on 18 March 2014. Since then, the peninsula has been administered as the de facto Crimean Federal District, constituting two Russian federal subjects, the Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol. The annexation was preceded by a military intervention by Russia in Crimea, which took place in the aftermath of the 2014 Ukrainian Revolution and was part of wider unrest across southern and eastern Ukraine. On 23 February, Russian President Vladimir Putin convened an all-night meeting with security services chiefs to discuss extrication of the deposed Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych, and at the end of that meeting Putin had remarked that we must start working on returning Crimea to Russia. On the 23rd of February, pro-Russian demonstrations were held in the Crimean city of Sevastopol. On the 27th of February, masked Russian troops without insignia took over the Supreme Council of Crimea and captured strategic sites across Crimea, which led to the installation of the pro-Russian action of government in Crimea and the declaration of Crimea's independence. Ukraine considers the annexation to be a violation of international law and agreements by Russia, including agreement on establishing the Commonwealth of Independent States in 1991, Helsinki Accords, Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons of 1994 and Treaty on Friendship, Cooperation and Partnership between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. The event was condemned by many world leaders as an illegal annexation of Ukrainian territory, in violation of the 1994 Budapest Memorandum on Sovereignty and Territorial Integrity of Ukraine, signed by Russia. It led to the other members of the then G8 suspending Russia from the group, then introducing the first round of sanctions against the country. The United Nations General Assembly also rejected the vote on annexation, adopting a non-binding resolution affirming the territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Following a Crimean referendum held on 16 March 2014, in which separation was favored by a large majority of voters, the UN resolution also underscores that the referendum, having no validity, cannot form the basis for any alteration of the status of. The resolution calls upon all states and international organizations not to recognize or to imply the recognition of Russia's annexation. The Russian Federation opposes the annexation label, with Putin defending the referendum as complying with the principle of self-determination of peoples. In July 2015, Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev said that Crimea had been fully integrated into Russia. Background: Crimea became part of the Russian Empire in 1783, when the Crimean Khanate was annexed, then became part of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic until 1954. Initially it was incorporated into the empire as Taurida Oblast, but in 1795 it was merged into Novorossiysk Governorate and then, in 1802, transferred to the Taurida Governorate. A series of short-lived governments were established during first stages of the Russian Civil War, but they were followed by White Russian. In October 1921, the Crimean Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic of the Russian SFSR was instituted. After the Second World War and the subsequent deportation of all of the indigenous Crimean Tatars, the Crimean ASSR was stripped of its autonomy in 1946 and was downgraded to the status of an oblast of the Russian SFSR. In 1954, the Crimean Oblast was transferred from the Russian SFSR to the Ukrainian SSR by decree of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the Soviet Union. In 1989, under Perestroika, the Supreme Soviet declared that the deportation of the Crimean Tatars under Stalin had been illegal, and the mostly Muslim ethnic group was allowed to return to Crimea. In 1990, the Soviet of the Crimean Oblast proposed the restoration of the Crimean ASSR. The Oblast conducted a referendum in 1991, which asked whether Crimea should be elevated into a signatory of the new Union Treaty. By that time, though, the dissolution of the Soviet Union was well underway. The Crimean ASSR was restored for less than a year as part of Soviet Ukraine before Ukrainian independence. Newly independent Ukraine maintained Crimea's autonomous status, while the Supreme Council of Crimea affirmed the peninsula's sovereignty as a part of Ukraine. The autonomous status of Crimea was limited by Ukrainian authorities in 1995. In September 2008, the Ukrainian Foreign Minister Volodymyr Oroszko accused Russia of giving out Russian passports to the population in the Crimea and described it as a real problem given Russia's declared policy of military intervention abroad to protect Russian citizens. On the 24th of August 2009, anti-Ukrainian demonstrations were held in Crimea by ethnic Russian residents. Sergei Sekov said then that he hoped that Russia would treat the Crimea the same way as it had treated South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Crimea is populated by an ethnic Russian majority and a minority of both ethnic Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars, and thus demographically possessed one of the Ukraine's largest Russian populations. Euromaidan and the Ukrainian Revolution. The Euromaidan protest movement began in Kiev in late November 2013 after President Viktor Yanukovych, of the Party of Regions, suspended the signing of the Ukraine-European Union Association Agreement. Yanukovych won the 2010 presidential election with strong support from voters in the autonomous Republic of Crimea and southern and eastern Ukraine. The Crimean autonomous government strongly supported Yanukovych and condemned the protests, saying they were threatening political stability in the country. The Crimean Autonomous Parliament said that it supported the government's decision to suspend negotiations on the pending association agreement and urged Crimeans to strengthen friendly ties with Russian regions. On 4 February 2014, the Presidium of the Supreme Council considered holding a referendum on the peninsula's status, and asked the Russian government to guarantee the vote. The Security Service of Ukraine responded by opening a criminal case to investigate the possible subversion of Ukraine's territorial integrity. On 20 February 2014, during a visit to Moscow, Chairman of the Supreme Council of Crimea Vladimir Konstantinov stated that the 1954 transfer of Crimea from the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic had been a mistake. The Euromaidan protests came to a head in late February 2014, and Yanukovych and many of his ministers fled the capital on the 22nd of February. After his flight, opposition parties and defectors from the Party of Regions put together a parliamentary quorum in the Verkhovna Rada, and voted on the 22nd of February to remove Yanukovych from his post on the grounds that he was unable to fulfill his duties. Although this legislative removal lacked the required three-quarter vote of sitting Rada members according to the constitution in effect at the time, which the Rada also voted to suspend. Arseniy Yatsenyuk was appointed by the Rada to serve as the head of a caretaker government until new presidential and parliament elections could be held. This new government was recognized internationally, though the Russian government said that these events had been a coup d'état, and that the caretaker government was illegitimate.